Okay, we're picking up with a new topic today, which will occupy us for today and next Thursday. Just in advance, Thursday the following week, Thursday next week, I won't be here. I have to leave town. I'll send an email around about it, but we won't have a lecture on Thursday. But we've plenty of material, don't worry. So the topic we're turning to today is social cognition. It's about our collective nature, and it's a very interesting topic that needs to be addressed from multiple perspectives, and it raises certain challenges in thinking about ourselves. In one respect, when we talk about social cognition, we might be talking about something like language, which exists between people, and culture, which varies as we move around from one society to the next. And those are indeed things we'll be interested in because those are unique aspects, or somewhat unique aspects, of human sociality in particular. On the other hand, though, we're looking at something more fundamental than merely the human thing. We're looking at something which belongs to life. All life forms are social. Every bacterium, every blade of grass is a social being, and the biosphere that surrounds the Earth is an intricate, dense network of interrelated beings. That doesn't mean that when the antelope is getting eaten by a lion in the Serengeti that it's about to burst into Disney's Circle of Life song, but it means that no life form can be understood in the absence of other life forms. Very often, the most important other life forms are members of the same species, so humans to humans, but humans bear very interesting relationships to grasses, for example, and to mosquitoes, and to all other kinds of animals. Now, up to now, we've dealt with theories which were frequently grounded in psychology, and most psychological theories seem to describe, or attempt to describe, the mind of an individual. We've run into very many problems with this, but by and large, psychology assumes that there is such a thing as an individual mind which is separate from all others. Rodin's famous The Thinker statue here shows someone thinking very, very hard, introspecting probably, a bit like Descartes, removed from senses, removed from interaction with other people. And thinking or introspecting perhaps provides something of a skewed view of our lives and worlds and experiences. If you take introspection and this individual thinking too far, you end up with a position that nobody, I think, would defend, which is solipsism. Solipsism is the idea that you're the only one that exists. You're the only one you have any direct evidence for. Everyone else could be just a fiction in your own mind. So the entire world out there is just a projection of my mind. Actually, solipsism is only ever available to one person. It tends not to go down well with other people because they tend to see themselves negated in the prospect. But I assure you that the only person in the world who can be a solipsist is me, not you. Right? Nobody wants to actually defend that position. It's a ridiculous position. So perhaps we need a way to work towards an understanding of mind that is less individual, less discrete, less separate, and more interconnected and more social. And we've encountered this kind of problem several times in the course of this module. We've contrasted these positions before. On the left, you see a strongly representational view in which the world and the mind are separate domains, and the world leaks in through the mind and has to be built up again as a picture of the world. A weird view, but one that has had a lot of currency in theories of psychology, but it tends to divorce the subject from their own world. We've seen contributions from embodied cognitive science and robotics here on the right. There's a phrase from Rodney Brooks, a roboticist: the external world is its own best representation, in which the behavior and experience of an individual has to be considered in conjunction with the context or the environment in which it occurs. And those kind of insights are helpful, but we've a lot of work left to do in resolving these various positions, and I'm not sure we're ever going to get to the bottom of all this. When I speak of the importance of the context in which behavior happens, or the situation in which experience arises, I'm speaking of environment, but I'm using the word in a very specific sense. I don't mean it in this sense. I don't mean like the distinction between a jungle and a desert and a mountain. These are very nice pictures of places that probably none of us have ever been to. The environment for most people, if you were to take a picture of it, for most of you, it looks a bit like this. This is University College Dublin. And some of the notable physical features of University College Dublin is that the ground is paved and level. Where there's an incline, you tend to encounter steps or ramps even. Where there's an obstacle, there tends to be a means of getting around it or opening it. Doors have handles. The chairs you're sitting on were designed for sitting, so it's not particularly challenging. That's a fairly typical human environment. We humans engineered the material world to support our activities so that our minds or our awareness is freed up for other things. If you were walking through the jungle, I assure you, you would not have time to be thinking about the complexities of our social cognition. Walking through the jungle would occupy you fully. It's a very, very challenging and somewhat dangerous act to walk through a jungle. Walking through UCD is less dangerous. That doesn't mean it's less challenging, it's just the challenges are different. The challenges here don't arise from the physical environment. The most important, interesting, and challenging elements here are always going to be other people. As you walk through UCD, you're taking account of other people, you're avoiding other people, you're hanging out with other people, you're going to meet other people. Other people are clearly the most important elements in your environment. Now, the theme of social cognition is of interest to a broad spectrum of people. Many of these we've met before. Up at the top right here, developmental psychology. We've seen the ongoing discussions about the degree to which the development of an individual can be considered from an individualist perspective, as Jean Piaget would have suggested, or the degree to which that can only be understood in the social context in which it arose, as Vygotsky suggested. So we've seen a lot of this discussion there. When we came to talk about brains, we saw the recent great interest that has arisen in trying to understand the brains of people as they interact with each other in real time. You remember that rather funny video we saw of two people strapped down to the beer of an fMRI machine, forced to stare at each other's face, and then wheeled into the scanner. And we've seen multiple hyperscanning methods because brains in social interaction are different things than brains of isolated individuals. Robotics and artificial intelligence and computer science generally have also got interests in this area. On the one hand, a lot of interest in robotics revolves not around creating big, self-contained, highly individual robots, but creating swarms of small little robots, insect-like robots. A chap called Tomasz Wiesiek, whose work we'll look at a little bit later, actually has swarms of drones with which you can understand the kind of small-scale social interaction that give rise to flocking behavior in birds, shoaling behaviors in fish, and the like. Similarly, the latest of the artificial intelligence algorithms that underpin your Netflix recommendations, your Facebook and your Twitter, are all seeking to understand not you as an individual, but you as a networked individual. You seen through the prism of your friends and your friends' friends, your social relations. Because it turns out that that's where the most important information about you is to be found. So they have a stake in this as well. Today we'll be largely concerned with comparative psychology, or just comparing humans to other species. The obvious point of reference here will be the great apes, and we'll have a lot to say about who the great apes are and how they differ from other animals. But that's not the only point of reference. And one of the main themes we'll have today is putting up warning signs, pointing out that the study of biology, and in particular evolutionary history alone, is not enough to provide you with insight into forms of social organization. And it certainly doesn't provide you with any normative framework with which you can say that's a good form of social organization or that's a bad one. And the next day we'll turn to the business of social psychology, where psychology, being invested in this business of individual minds, runs into dire trouble when it comes to work on, acknowledge, or treat of our collective nature. So our treatment of social psychology will be a litany of horrors. We'll save that for next week, for Thursday's lecture. It's kind of fun as well. So there's a lot of people have stake in this. I want to remind you of one thing that arose in the context of our consideration of language. And here we're going to just consider it more generally, not solely with respect to language, but with respect to our social shared worlds, and that's the cooperative I hypothesis of Michael Tomasello, which we introduce. There is one biological change that happened since the last common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and bonobos. So 5 or 6 million years ago, there was one species there, and there was a split. One branch went on, it's a rather complicated story, went on to become modern Homo sapiens, and lots of other things as well, but modern Homo sapiens, the other things have all died out. And the other branch has not died out, but it split again, and it developed two species. One is the chimpanzee, and one is the bonobo. Together they form a larger unit, pan, which is sometimes referred to as chimpanzee, but really I like the term chimpanzee to be separate from bonobo because they're separate species, something that wasn't realized until the 1970s. And we'll have a look at bonobos and chimpanzees and how they differ. But sometime in that short, from an evolutionary point of view, short period of time, 5 or 6 million years, there's one change that we know happens, and it has nothing to do with nervous systems, it has to do with the white of the eye. We developed this white sclera, which, given that we have colored irises and dark pupils, means the eyes become an extremely informative social signal. They tell other people what you're paying attention to. And this seems to have been a game changer. This has changed things radically. On the one hand, we know that individuals who have difficulty with maintaining what we would consider to be normal or conventional social relations very often have disturbed patterns of eye contact. So we see this in autism, for example. But there's a lot more to it than that. Let's just have a look at these apes. The top is a human eye and the bottom is a real ape. Look at how dark the eyes are. The one on the very bottom is an ape from Planet of the Apes. See what they did there? They didn't tell you that, but they made them look super intelligent by giving them white sclera. And so the white of the eye means that this ape suddenly looks shifty. You can see where this ape is looking. That ape couldn't look shifty. It's not in its gift. So this white of the eye business allows us to pay attention to the same thing. I can look at you and I can see what you're looking at so that we then look at the same thing. It's a very, very simple idea with profound consequences. It means that humans, from the moment they're born, swim in a sea of joint attention. We're always paying attention to the same things as other humans, to the same things as our caregivers. And in a very short period of time, children learn to go from looking to see where their caregivers are looking and being able to follow their gaze to actually manipulating the caregiver's gaze so that they can direct the gaze of their caregivers. This is a very strong bond between us. And if you think about what it means, if we're paying attention to the same thing at the same time, then we have adopted a common perspective. We will interpret things that go on in a common way. Right now, we're all involved in a lecture, and that provides us with a shared perspective. If, God help us, a bomb were to go off out there, or the fire alarm were to go on, we would respond in a common way because we're coming from a common situation, paying attention to the same thing at the same time. So Tomasello's cooperative I hypothesis, I think, is quite brilliant. It suggests that genes might not be the right place to look to understand differences between ourselves and our nearest neighbors from an evolutionary point of view. We have almost the same genes as the apes, the great apes, but we have this enormous difference in our social organization, in language, apparently in our cognitive skills. And joint attention might just be a really important part of the story that helps us to account for that. Now, Tomasello does interesting work. He compares humans to apes. That's a kind of comparative primatology, to give it a full name. And it's one of the ways in which one can address the question of, well, what makes humans special, or also what are the similarities and commonalities and differences between humans and other species. And the question of what makes a human is an old one. It belongs to the discipline of anthropology. Anthropology has a checkered history, to put it mildly. Anthropology is the study of what makes, well, I'm even going to use a contentious word here, mankind. Notice the gendering of that phrase. And notice the fact that anthropology started off as a business of white privileged European males going off to foreign countries to look at savages and try to explain them from their privileged white European point of view using the set of concepts that they had available to them. Nobody wants to do that. That's a very bad way to do it. So anthropology has constantly dealt with this problem that you're looking from a particular perspective. You have a particular set of biases. You can't not have a set of biases. You can't not come from one culture or another. So a lot of the business of anthropology is this kind of navel-gazing or worrying about whether it's possible to say something about something which is foreign or other to you. And that's why anthropology has a strained relationship with science, because it doesn't have that sense of distance that we like to get from scientific exercises. But the study of human cultures and languages persists, of course. Paleoanthropology is an interesting business in which we analyze the material traces of past cultures, particularly those that didn't leave any writing. We have to draw inferences from such things as burial remains, musical instruments, cave paintings, jewelry, technologies that might suggest languages. These are the kind of sources of evidence that are brought to bear as we try to figure out, for example, when did language enter the equation? Language itself, of course, leaves no fossils. Primatology belongs in here because we do want to understand ourselves in relation to other species. But as I said, one of the main things we're going to learn today is that biology does not determine who you are and what your form of social organization is. There is genetic variation within the human species as well as between humans and our ape species. And although we like to emphasize the fact that there's very little difference between humans and apes, we also play down the fact that there's considerable genetic variation within humans. So again, this would suggest we might want to hold off from looking to genetics for too strong a signal as to how our society, as the basis for understanding our social organization. Now, many of you, of course, will have tried to point something out to a dog. Some dogs get it, some dogs don't. Not all animals exhibit this kind of joint attention. Chimps do try to pay attention to what other chimps are doing. But as we've seen, they don't have the same strong signal available to them. And so chimps will tend to follow the head gaze of another chimp. So if a lot of chimpanzees have their heads pointing one way, a new chimpanzee joining the party will look in the same general direction. But that's a much cruder signal than the eyes. And there's a tree of life, not to scale because we don't know what an appropriate scale for the tree of life is. And there at the top we've got apes and humans. Let's just blow them up a little bit. And I want to alert you to something that sort of bothers me when I see it in exams. There's a big difference between apes and monkeys. Please don't call chimpanzees monkeys. They're not monkeys. Don't call gorillas monkeys. And don't confuse the apes with the monkeys. We do share a lot in common with monkeys and with the larger family, which is primates. But these apes are very, very special. Orangutans, gorillas, humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees. And here we can trace back the tree to the last common ancestor of the three there, the humans, the bonobos, and chimpanzees, about 6 million years ago. We go back to about 8 million years ago, we have the last common ancestor of all those with the chimpanzee. And the orangutans are a little further removed from us. We have to go back about 12 or 16 million years ago. After that, you find the common ancestors with monkeys. And you start looking at things like gibbons and baboons and so on. But please don't confuse monkeys and apes. The big family of primates is really, really interesting. And we have lots in common with lorises and tarsiers and monkeys and lemurs and apes. But we are most closely related to the great apes, these five, the magic five. Chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and humans. And it's only been 5 or 6 million years ago, which is not a long time. Now, it's going to come as no surprise to any of you that chimpanzees are tool users. We've seen that even crows are capable of building tools and using tools in quite sophisticated ways. I'm going to show you a little video, though, that points out something rather different. It points out that in studying chimpanzees who live in these discrete communities, some communities develop technologies that then become part of the cultural good of that community, and they're not found species-wide. So we're going to look at a particular example, and the point here is not to illustrate the tool use, it's to illustrate the cultural specificity of it, the fact that it's local. So, do you have sound? Yeah.
Wild chimpanzees using tools to get honey from bee nests have been observed in many parts of Africa. But now, research field video shows chimpanzees in the Congo Basin may have developed sophisticated technical solutions that differ from those of apes in other regions. The research, funded in part by the National Geographic Society, is published in the current issue of the International Journal of Primatology. The scientists videotaped 30 instances of honey gathering using tools, and the video documented 12 different individual chimps doing this. The chimpanzees were recorded in the Gualogo Triangle, Republic of Congo. Pounding was the most common strategy to open beehives here. While using tools like sticks to dip into a hive to extract honey has been observed in other wild chimpanzee populations, pounding of beehives seems exclusive to chimpanzees in the Congo Basin. Bees have developed effective means of protecting their hives that usually involve fortification and concealment of their nests. Some build nests in tree hollows or other pre-existing cavities, as these chimps have found. Chimps were observed pounding a hive as many as 1,000 times in a single session. The scientists point out the significant effort to open the hive was successful just a little over 50% of the time, and they attained relatively small amounts of honey for the effort. Most honey-gathering episodes involved 1 or 2 tools, but up to 5 tools were used by a single individual. Chimps use the tools one at a time and one after another in a serial fashion. The research was done by Dave Morgan of the Lester E. Fisher Center for the Study and Conservation of Apes at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, and Cricket Sands of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany.
So, that's really interesting. I don't know how to interpret chimpanzee culture. I don't know how to interpret any culture. I know that I come at this from a particular perspective, white, Irish, 20th century, and so on. And it gets harder as I move away from my home base, and it doesn't stop at the species boundary. When we come to chimpanzees, we find here we've got technologies which are local to one group, shared among that group, passed down in a manner that to us speaks of cultural transmission. So culture is not the boundary of our species in this respect. In fact, I really want to point out that biology doesn't really dictate our social lives. It does for some animals. These are ants and termites and bees, and lots of insects have what are called eusocial communities. And in a eusocial community, the individual is born and their life will be spent fulfilling a single social role. You're a soldier, or you're a worker, or you're a queen. There's lots of these roles, and they're invariant. They're maintained through very interesting means, usually by the certain kinds of chemical interaction between the individuals and the species. But what you end up with is a form of social organization that has strictly 2 layers. You've got this layer of the individual where you have an invariant role, and you've got the colony level. And most of the behavior of the individual can only be understood with respect to the colony, not with respect to their own lives. So if you're a soldier, you will gladly sacrifice yourself for the colony. This caused a lot of concern among scientists at the start of the 20th century as they began to see that in order to understand the behavior of an individual, the unit of reference was not the individual but was the colony. And they started to wonder, does this mean that our social organizations are determined by our biology? And that then gives rise to, it opens the door to all kinds of unhelpful, unwarranted suggestions from the animal scientists as to how human societies should be organized, suggesting that there's a right or a wrong way to do things. But biology doesn't actually determine your social roles. It's true if you're an ant, you're born into one of these roles and that's what you're going to have. But this kind of eusocial organization is not simply because they're insects. So there's one very interesting kind of mammal that displays this. Well, there's 2 subspecies. There's a naked mole rat in northeastern Africa and the Damaraland mole rat in Namibia. Anyone seen a naked mole rat? Cool, aren't they? Really, really ugly. Let's have a look at naked mole rat, because they display this kind of insect-like organization, but they are mammals.
The naked mole rat. Although it's neither a mole nor a rat. Much about their behavior is strange. They spend their entire lives in virtually complete darkness, weaving their way through an underground network of burrows and tunnels. Within their dark universe, they've evolved a rigid society that has more in common with ants or bees than with a typical mammalian social circle. At the top is a long, strong queen. She is the mother of all the other mole rats in the colony, which may total a few dozen or a few hundred. As long as she lives, she and a few chosen boy toys are the only ones that breed. The queen keeps the rest from mating by sheer intimidation. Their lives are all work and no foreplay. Some mole rats are drafted as soldiers to protect the colony from rival mole rats and predators. A quick sniff determines insider from outsider. Other mole rats tend to the young, clean burrows, dig tunnels, and look for food. Their giant incisors actually are outside their mouths, so the mole rats can shovel away without eating dirt. They dig in teams. The lead digger carves out the tunnel. Others pass the dirt back up the tunnel and out onto the surface. Going backwards or forwards is all the same. Though nearly blind, special hairs on their body help guide them and tell them where they're going. And even when traveling in the tunnels, each one's status in the hierarchy is clearly visible. The more senior members of the colony take the high road, while the juniors wriggle through underneath. The tunnels are only a few inches wide, but a full-fledged colony can stretch for half a mile. All this work is done to find their principal food, tubers scattered across the savanna. One of these giant roots can feed a colony for 2 to 3 weeks. And though they are born into a strict hierarchy, when it comes to food, everyone is equal.
So, naked mole rats give us another hint that biology, or nature if you want to call it, doesn't dictate your social organization. I want to bring that home very strongly, that anyone who tells you that one particular form of social organization is natural and another is unnatural is not supported by science. And we happily do not live this kind of miserable life of a naked mole rat. I'm sure they're very happy, but I don't want to live like one. We're primates. And primates, this big family that includes apes, humans, monkeys, and a few others, we are fluidly social. We spend a lot of our time defending our roles. A naked mole rat or an ant is never promoted or demoted, but humans are, and baboons are. We have to take care and defend our social roles, and nearly everything we do as humans is concerned with this. The whole idea of getting a job, of dressing in a particular way, behaving in a particular way, not disgracing yourself. All this has to do with maintaining, sustaining, taking care of your position in a vast network of social relations. That always has to be considered as dynamic. Given this dynamism, it would be interesting to compare humans to our nearest neighbors. Now, there was a time when it was thought that chimpanzees were our nearest neighbor from an evolutionary point of view. And one of the main reasons that people resisted Darwin's theory of evolution was precisely because they believed in biological determinism. And they looked at those chimpanzees and they didn't like what they saw. Not only were they throwing their poo, they were biting the testicles off each other in battles. They were aggressive, violent, and didn't seem to provide a nice kind of role model. And if we came from them, then we'd have to be like them, wouldn't we? Well, happily, we're no longer in that position. we know an awful lot more. And it's interesting to compare chimpanzees with bonobos because we're equally closely related to both of them. And while they have a lot in common, there are interesting differences there as well. And the differences should clue us in that there's no way that you can take these as examples and say, the natural condition of humans is X, Y, or Z. So in both cases, we find communities with big open subgroups. Chimpanzee societies are patriarchal. The men rule the roost, and a growing young male has to go out and leave the troop to found his own dynasty. Bonobos are matriarchal. The women move and the women rule the society. So we've got female dominance in one case and male dominance in another, although we've got strong mother-child relationships in both cases. Grooming is common in both, but where they really differ is the roles of aggression and sex. Chimpanzees sort their differences out first and foremost by violence. They are really aggressive and they're really strong. They are not suitable as pets. They will do serious damage to you. They're much stronger than humans and they fight quite a lot. They have sex really primarily for reproductive purposes. If you don't know about bonobo sex, cover your delicate little ears. They have incest, masturbation, homosexual sex among males, among females, group sex. They, you know the way Cuchulainn and Ferdia were sent out as representing the two different groups and they fought a battle? That's very chimpanzee-like. Bonobos, when the two troops of bonobos meet, send out their best warriors and they copulate. They solve all their problems through sex. They have some limited role of aggression, but not a whole lot. Bonobos would make your granny blush. Let's have a look at them. There's no bonobo pornography here, but I hope this is interesting. You should distinguish between bonobo faces and
research here
chimpanzee
in Wamba
faces.
Zaire for the past 22 years. He comes here in search of the second little-known species of chimpanzee. Sugarcane is a sweet lure used to call down the elusive bonobo. Dr. Kano and his associate Chia Hashimoto have discovered that bonobos are quite distinct from the chimps studied by Goodall and Bush. At first glance, they are different. Although they've been called pygmy chimps, they're not smaller, just more slightly built. Hunted elsewhere in Zaire, they're safe here, but wary still. The sugarcane buffet proves irresistible. At ease on 2 legs, as well as on 4, they simply rise up and walk, so their hands are free to carry the cane. Eerily, their long, shapely limbs and upright gait recall our own prehistoric forebears. And their natural 2-legged gait is only the first surprise they have in store for us. An impressively stirring female enters and snaps a young sapling. Once she picks herself up, she does something entirely surprising for a female chimp. She displays, and the males give her sway. For this is the confident stride of the group's leader, its alpha female, whom Kano has named Haru.
The alpha female to whom the others give sway is really, really very remarkable. Now, bonobos were mistaken for a subspecies of chimpanzee for a long time because they live in specific areas in West Africa that are plagued by civil war for very many decades. So Democratic Republic of Congo, Congo itself, Central African Republic. There's not very many places. The communities are small. And it's only since the 1970s that they've really recognized how different they are. The important lesson for us to learn here is that biology doesn't determine your social organization. That there's lots of choice points, there's lots of different ways that you could be organized. So we are equally closely related to chimpanzees and bonobos, and they differ hugely in how they sort things out, how they structure their societies. Sorting things out is really important. I mentioned that these two species have very different ways of doing it. Among primate species generally, we find what's something quite remarkable that I don't know of that it exists outside of that, and that's reconciliation behavior. We have ways of getting over our disagreements. Now, we're atrociously bad at this, but we humans even do this as well. We have things like the Labour Relations Committee, we have judges, we have means for sorting out our disputes. And there's evidence for this kind of behavior in at least 25 primate species. And it's a good way to, reconciliation behavior is probably necessary if you're going to have large numbers of fluidly social animals who have to get by together. If grudges are born and persist indefinitely, that makes the whole thing unstable. Chimpanzees actually use mediators. That is, if there's a dispute within the chimpanzee troop, the eldest chimpanzees will send in a wise chimpanzee to sort things out and act as an intermediary. That seems to be essential to us to give the kind of stability that's required. We need fluidity and stability in order to ground the kind of societies that we have. Now, I've been quite insistent that there's a big distinction between apes and monkeys. And there are things we could look at like opposable thumbs that we're not going to look at. We're going to be focused here on one specific difference. If you look at human brains and those of our ape cousins, there's no cell in a human brain that you won't also find in an ape brain. We have exactly the same set of cells. We have slight differences in the relative size of different parts of the brain. We have slight differences in the degree to which the two sides of the brain exhibit different functions, but that's it. At the border between the ape and the monkey, we do find one difference. It's not a big difference, but there's a kind of cell that you find in ape brains that you don't find in monkey cells. Here you see two kinds of cells found in the cortex of apes and humans, but not, well, the one on the right, pyramidal cell, you'll also find in monkeys. They're very widely distributed. They're the most frequent type of cell in the cortex. We know them very, very well. And their structure is quite different from the one on the left, a spindle cell, which is only found in the apes and in the humans. Spindle cells were discovered at the end of the 19th century by a chap called von Economo, so they're sometimes also called von Economo neurons. And they're interesting, but I have to be careful. I don't know what they do. But there again, I don't know what any part of the brain does. And I want to inject a note of caution when we describe what a particular cell or network or area in the brain does. We've seen some of the pitfalls that arise there. These were discovered in an area known as the anterior cingulate cortex. It's a part of the cortex at the base of the brain. And it's a really complicated bit. Anything to do with our social lives, you'll find involvement of this part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex. In all 5 ape species, we find these, but we find much less of them in the orangutan. We find somewhat less of them in the gorilla. We find a good deal and comparable amounts in chimpanzees and bonobos, and we find considerably more in humans. So they seem to have something to do with the distance between us and them. As you go further away, you find less of them. And as you move into the monkeys, you don't find them at all. They're in an area of the brain that we know is crucially important for our social relations. And when you get to humans, they're spilling out from the anterior cingulate cortex into frontoorbital cortex, into that prefrontal part of the brain that Phineas Gage had the misfortune to blow away. And you know that Phineas Gage's social relations were hugely changed after that. So it's a deeply mysterious, deeply human part of the brain that we're talking about. So I want to be very careful about ascribing them a function. Here, this link between social order and biology is difficult to know. And that would be the end of the story, except for a very interesting twist that has arisen in the last few years, although these have been known for over 100 years. And to do that, we have to describe what convergent evolution is. Convergent evolution arises when, in the course of the large-scale processes of evolution, the same problem or opportunity gives rise multiple times to the same kind of solution. Now let's look at visual systems. Because of the kind of planet we live in, there's a lot of information potentially available in the distribution of light. Any animal that can make use of that will do better than animals that don't. And so visual systems have evolved several times in parallel. And if you didn't know what a visual system was for, here would be a clue that there's something there, namely the distribution of light, that's worth your attention. So octopus eyes have no common evolutionary history with human eyes, for example. Insect eyes have no common evolutionary history with either. But eyes tend to evolve, visual systems tend to evolve in different ways because there's something that's there. Something similar can be observed in hot desert environments. Now, there are a number of geographically separated places in the world where we find these hot desert environments. And what we find is that we see the same kind of animals recurring in these, even though they're unrelated to each other and even though they share no common evolutionary path more recently. So the North American kangaroo rat, the Australian hopping mice, no, the kangaroos in America, and whatever. And the jerboa in North Africa. And these are 4 different species that are unrelated to each other. Let's have a look at them. That's what they look like. They're the kangaroo rat, the Australian hopping mouse, the North African jerboa, and the Asian jerboa. And they have a lot of common features. They all have the small, rounded body shape, big hind legs, long, thin tails, bipedal hop. They're nocturnal. They burrow. They eat seeds. It's like they're built from the same blueprint. But they don't share a common evolutionary history. They're not that closely related. Their common ancestors are much more divergent. What you see here is the match between the environment and the organism. And because the environment recurs, hot deserts simply recur around the world, we see convergent evolution. And if we didn't know about the environment, looking at the similarities across these animals, and they certainly do look very similar, would alert us that there's something interesting here that we need to pay attention to. And we go, oh yeah, it's the hot desert environment. Now let's come back to those spindle cells, because while we're interested in them and we find them in the apes and not in the monkeys, a few years ago they were found in a female humpback whale. There's no denying it. Morphologists, histologists, the people who know their cells, see these and they go, yep, that's a spindle cell and it's in the same part of the brain, anterior cingulate cortex, in this mammal, which has a very different evolutionary history. It lives in water, for God's sake. Now, we don't know yet whether they occur in male humpback whales. Females and males in the humpback whales have different lives. The females work together closely and they work as a team to raise pods of calves. And as they grow up, if they're male, they go off and live distinguished, solitary, lonely, heroic lives in the North Atlantic, whereas the females bond together and sort of grow the next generation. Since then, though, they have been found in other cetaceans. Cetaceans are the whales, dolphins, and porpoises, all these highly intelligent, highly social mammals, which they don't have human language, but they have rich vocal forms of communication, rich social lives, and a great deal of intelligence. So here's something really interesting. We've got convergent evolution. We've got the same structural features occurring deep in the nervous system in species that live such very different lives, but have some things in common. And then it gets even more interesting. A couple of years ago, they were found in elephants. Elephants. Now, elephants, cetaceans, the whales and porpoises and dolphins, and humans. You've got to go back a long way to find a common ancestor, and nearly everything in between does not have these. So these have arisen independently in 3 contexts. What do we find in elephants? We find extremely social animals, extremely intelligent animals, animals that we could almost say have kind of culture. We know that elephants bring their dead to a particular site. Elephant sociality is kind of transparent to humans. We empathize, we understand elephants, and elephants understand us. We have a long history of cooperation with elephants. So I don't know what this means, but I do know that what we're seeing here tells us that these spindle cells are worth our attention, that they have something to do with the complexity of our social lives, possibly something to do with that which makes us humans, but which establishes commonalities that are different from the ones that we see from the evolutionary tree. So here we're seeing commonalities not by going back in time, but by jumping across and looking at similar forms of social organization among highly intelligent animals with a rich variety of behaviors and a rich variety of communicative behaviors. And that surely is worth our while. So we can learn a lot from studying other animals, and one of the first things we learn is that biology does not dictate your form of social organization, though you can learn a lot about it from it. We'll pick the story up on Thursday as we delve into social psychology, which will be, I'm afraid, a chamber of horrors. Right. It's something to look forward to.